All right, so let's go down and look at a couple of things. The pectoral girdle now, because now we're talking about appendicular. So this is about the appendages and the associated structures. So pectoral is around the chest and shoulder. So that's the upper limbs, the arms. Clavicle, we'll see, and the scapulae. Scapula is singular. Clavicle, not much to know about the clavicle. It's the collarbone. There's two of them. This is a paired bone, means it's on both sides. It's S-shaped if you lay it on a table. So there's three things you need to know here from me. First of all, you have to identify as the clavicle and tell me which is the sternal end and which is the acromial end. Of course, the sternal end will articulate with the sternum, and the acromial end will articulate with the scapula. And later on, we'll talk about what the acromion is, because that's always on practicals, the chromion process of the scapula. So let's take a look. And the carno, don't worry about these. So here is the clavicle. So what I could tell you is this, like this is the right clavicle, which I'm not going to ask you right or left. We'll never do that on clavicle. But here's the sternal end. And what do you notice? It's kind of flat compared to this side is more blunt, which looks more like the end of a field hockey stick. And this is sharper. So this is the inferior view when you're looking up from the bottom. So it's straighter. So the clavicle is attaching to the sternum here. You can see it up there. I always look at this little guy up here with the bone highlighted. So when we go into APR, when you go into APR, that's all you really need to know. This is the clavicle, and is this the sternal end or the acromial end? Now the scapula is probably the most complicated of the appendicular structures when you're doing it in pictures, online. And in lab, it's not that easy either, but at least you'll be able to pick up the bone and see what's going on. So these are all important. There's many parts to the scapula, like the spine is, you're going to see is telling that it's posterior. Acromion is the big bone that's on the outer part, lateral. And you could feel that if you pressed on your shoulder, you could feel that hard bone in there. Coracoid process is another process that you could feel if you press it to the front of your shoulder. So again, we need a picture here. Let's take a picture. And all the borders and the angles and the fossas, which I'll tell you why that's important later. Okay, let's do it. So now, first of all, get your view, because we're looking at pictures. You're not able to pick this up. This is anterior. And this is the right scapula. This is posterior. So if I was looking at this bone on a desk, I would notice that this big spine right here is posterior. And this is the back. So you're looking at the right shoulder, you see this. So the humerus is going to articulate here. And that articulation is very important. This is a cavity called the glenoid cavity. So that's where the humeral head is going to articulate with the scapula. And then a lateral part called the acromion is just an extension, a process off the spine. And you can see it from the anterior. You look over here, you see the acromion. And this is a real big part of muscle attachments. So those two are important. Those three, really, the spine, the acromion, and the lateral glenoid cavity. So if you look at the anterior, you don't have the spine. It's not in the front. So again, looking at what's the lateral border is always on the same side as the glenoid cavity. Medial border is on the opposite side, which would go towards the middle, towards the spinal column. So now the fossas. And these are going to match up with muscles, like rotator cuff muscles, actually. They're called sits muscles. And I'll go over that again, but the muscles like supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, and subscapularis. Now, those, except for teres minor, they're all matching up with the fossas of the scapula because they're shoulder muscles, rotator cuff muscles. So the anterior fossa, and that's the whole space, and it's like a little bed where the muscle sits. And that's called the subscapular fossa. So that's anterior. You have to remember that. Posterior, you have now Infra means below. So this means below the spinous, below the spine of the scapula. So it's the infraspinous fossa. And above it, you have the supraspinous fossa. So these are all important. So it matches up, right? Like supraspinatus will sit in the supraspinous fossa, which is more posterior. The infraspinatus muscle will sit in the infraspinous fossa, which is definitely posterior. Teres minor is a muscle, it doesn't have a fossa. But subscapular fossa will house the subscapularis muscle, which is one of the rotator cuffs muscles. So one more thing, just again, this is probably the hardest thing, but another process which you can see anterior is the coracoid process, which is smaller, right? So when you look at the scapula later on the MH Connect, you have to kind of, look at lateral view, look at anterior view, look at posterior view. So that's the hard part about doing a lab like this online. You just have to look at all the different angles. So I'll help you when we do the review to show you the angles that have possible that are possible questions. So again, it's pretty hard. Now the bottom, the angles I'm not so big about, but inferior angle is at the bottom. Superior angle is at the top. You got those directional terms now because we did that last week. Superior angle. And there's a suprascapular notch. And here's the posterior view of the coracoid process. So go through the list, and I think this is the hardest. And you have to name right or left scapula, which makes it even harder. So that you have to kind of imagine where the humerus is going to go. And we'll go over the humerus soon. So the upper arm and the lower arm, we'll do both, all the bones. Here's the names. This is cool. Just to give you the names, like humerus is the long upper arm bone. Radius, remember, is thumb side in the anatomical position of a forearm. The ulna is medial, pinky side. Then you have 8 wrist bones, 5 hand bones, and 14 phalanges that make up your finger bones. And you'll see why there's 14, why there's not 3 on each of them, each of the 10. So the carpal bones are wrists, metacarpals are hand bones. And you should be able to name those. That's not too hard. The markings are the hardest, like on the humerus. I think we'll go right to the picture to save you time. So here is the right humerus again. Look, here's the dude in the anterior position, and here's the posterior. So this is the anterior, and this is posterior view of the same bone. So first thing you should notice is the head of the humerus. And it has 2 tubercles. There's a new word, tubercle. And again, that's going to be a marking for muscle. So the greater tubercle is more lateral. The lesser tubercle is more medial. It's a lot of work. Down the middle of the shaft of this humerus is the deltoid tuberosity, which is an insertion for the deltoid muscle. Insertion is the movable part of the bone, of the muscle, I should say. Now, let's just look over to the posterior where you can see other things. You have the head of the humerus. You can see the greater tubercle because it's bigger and lateral, but you can't see the lesser tubercle. Then you have the neck. You have a surgical neck and anatomical neck. So technically the anatomical neck is between the head and the shaft. The surgical neck means that this is the most commonly area of a fracture of the humerus. So that's why they call it surgical neck. But really, just know, first of all, know that this is a humerus when it's sitting by itself. That's not easy. That's the hardest part, usually at the beginning. Here's the deltoid tuberosity, the posterior view. Now down here, this is where things get a little kooky. And you have to really pay attention to what you're looking at, anterior, posterior. So anterior view, this part right here, this big thing here, right here, is called the medial epicondyle. So that's medial. So in anatomical position, that's going towards your midline. That's one thing, and that's medial. Remember, this is the right humerus. Then the only thing that's different on the lower part, other than that, is this little marble bone called the capitulum. It's lateral. That you only see from the anterior. The trochlea, which is on your list, is this little bow tie right here. And you're going to see later on that the ulna articulates with the trochlea like a wrench on a nut. So the trochlea you could see from posterior and anterior, but you could only see the capitulum from the anterior view. Now the fossas, these are important too. Now the back one is bigger. This is the one, again, anything with a cute name it always goes on the practical. So olecranon fossa is the back of your elbow, really, but it's the humor. It's not the humerus. I'm sorry. It's the ulna. The olecranon process is the ulna, but the fossa is on the humerus, on the distal humerus, and it's posterior. So you have to really remember that. Posterior is the olecranon. Anterior, you have the coronoid fossa, and that is a little less deep. It's more shallow, and that's going to house the coronoid process of the ulna, and you'll see what I'm talking about later. So the ulna, again, I'm sorry, the humerus, a lot of things going on, a lot of bone markings. So look at your list and look at all the different views that you can. Let me get right to it, the radius and ulna. So this is the radius and ulna, and they put them together for a reason, because at least you could see. And this is the right arm. You know, you can see how they articulate, and it kind of makes sense where the markings are. So this is anterior, this is posterior. Notice posterior, the olecranon process is the back of the ulna, proximal ulna now. You can see it there too. The coronoid process is on the anterior. So you have like this notch in the middle. It's really just a space. It kind of looks like a wrench. Like if I drew it, like this is the head of the ulna, or the top of the ulna, and then the bottom comes down like this. The space, and this is a side view, the space between the olecranon, and this would be the coronoid. Remember the shoulder blade, the scapula was coracoid. Now this is the coronoid process. So the space in between, like this wrench, is called the trochlear notch. And this is proximal ulna. Like this is proximal ulna and radius. This is distal, down by the wrist. So the wrist bones aren't there. So you can see there's a pointy lateral part of the radius and a pointy lateral part of the ulna, or medial part of the ulna, sorry. That's called the styloid process. So the radius is pretty straightforward. The radius has a head, looks just like a nail head actually, and that's proximal radius. Then it has a styloid process. Remember, the radius is lateral. So in the anatomical position, with your thumb pointing outward and lateral, the radius is on that side, on the lateral side. Now the hand, this is an anterior view, so you have all 8 carpals, and this is your distal radius and distal ulna. So the carpals make up your wrist. That's all these 8 bones. So know the carpals. I'm not going to ask you specific carpals on this exam. You have enough to worry about. So you just have to know they're carpals. That's all you need to know. And they're not tarsals. Tarsals are ankle bones, which we'll see later. Now look, the thumb is here. This is the right wrist and hand, anterior. So your palm's facing up is what you're looking at. The thumb is always designated digit 1. So the next finger, the ring finger, I'm sorry, the index finger would be 2. The middle finger would be 3. The ring finger 4. And the pinky is the 5th digit. So these parts right here are metacarpals, and that's your hand. So the carpal is your wrist. Metacarpal is your hand. Phalanges are fingers. So you, like the question would be like if I put a, well, let me just show you more. Let me just show you what the phalanges are, which are the fingers. So everything over here and down is phalanges. So you have proximal phalanges on every finger, all five, and you have distal phalange on all five. But the thumb only has two phalanges, no middle. Every other phalange group or finger has three phalanges, a middle. So you notice that, right? The thumb, and you see this on the big toe as well. There's only two on the big toe, two phalanges. So there's only proximal and distal phalange or phalanx, means the same thing. And then the other fingers have a proximal, middle, and distal all the way through. Not easy, my friends. Not easy. This is the pelvis. Basically, like this is two bones actually. Like there's one on, like this is the left, what we call os coxa, os coxae, like this, or coxa is fine. And this, it's really three bones put together. Like the big flaring bone is called the ilium. The front bone is called the pubis or pubic bone. And then the back where you sit on is called ischium. Let me just spell that for you. Ischium. So it's ilium, and that's the flaring bone, all this. And then you have the pubic, it's called pubic bone, and that's in the front. And there's a fibrocartilage disc in the front that connects the two pubic bones called the pubic symphysis. So that has a chance to be on too, the pubic symphysis. That's fibrocartilage disc between the two pubic bones. And the ischium is in the back. So ilium, ischium, and pubic bone make up the os coxa, left and right. And they articulate, the ilium articulates with the sacrum medially. So this is like the side view, right side in this case. And you can see this part up here, and I always ask this on the exam. This is the iliac crest. Then you have an area where the femur articulates, and that's called acetabulum. So get the spelling, it's on your list. I like to put all these cute names on, like acetabulum. And one more, this big hole in the pelvis is called the obturator foramen. Look at the spelling, obturator foramen. So here's the back. This is where you actually do sit on. It's called the ischial tuberosity. So you've heard tubercle, right, in the humerus, proximal humerus, the greater tubercle and the lesser tubercle. You've heard of tuberosity, like the deltoid tuberosity in the humerus as well, lateral humerus, that is an insertion point for the deltoid muscle, which you'll learn next time. And the ischial tuberosity is an attachment point in origin, actually, for the hamstring muscles in the back. So that, if that helps you remember, that the ischium is back posterior. So again, we'll look at the list. You'll see what parts you need to know other than the ones I'm showing you, but these are the main ones. And this is probably all you really need to know about the os coxa. This is a medial view, like looking from the inside out. So now, again, it's still the right one. Yes, the right one. And you can see this is the ischial tuberosity, ischium. And you see the iliac crest, it's all still there. It's very hard to do this in pictures without picking it up. And like I said, just like the scapula, it's hard enough to do it in the lab, let alone looking at pictures. So I give you a lot of credit for doing this, but I will make it as simple as possible and point out things like the obturator foramen. You can't see the acetabulum because this is a medial view. But you look at all different angles, and it's a lot of work on your own in the lab. MH Connect, right, on anatomy and physiology revealed. So I'll go through that. So really all we have left is the legs, and we could do that fairly quick.